So our first lesson that we will be doing as an online classroom is going to be Aggressors Invade Nations. This is the lesson that I asked you to take notes on prior to us leaving, and we will be working through this particular lecture today. What I would like you to do is to write down the title, write down the essential question: how did countries such as England and the United States, as well as the League of Nations, enable the attack of fascist and militarist countries? During the lecture, I would like you to write down the guiding question and answer each, providing specific examples. Our objective that I would like you to write down as well is that you can state which countries were aggressors and who they invaded. So the first one we're going to start with is Japanese imperialism. So our guiding questions that I will reiterate at the end is: who did the Japanese invade? What was their reason for invading? And what were the outcomes of this invasion, both the humanitarian toll and the international response? So the first thing that we need to understand is, what was Japan like prior to the war? And how did the military push the Japanese into the invasion? So during the 1920s, the Japanese government was becoming much more democratic, and they had a prime minister. That was very similar to Great Britain, because they did have an emperor, just as Great Britain had a king and a queen, but the prime minister was technically the head of government. Japan also signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which essentially said that they were renouncing war, that they were no longer going to go to war. However, this was problematic with the Japanese identity, because the Japanese identity had long been defined by something that we would call militarism, meaning an identification with the military. And when the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, the government was blamed, and the military leaders soon would gain more power and control over the country. What they wanted to do was restore traditional control of the government to the military and try to establish a new system of government. But instead of having a forceful leader like Mussolini or Hitler, the militarist would promote a symbol of state power under the guise of the empire, or emperor, sorry. And that emperor's name was Hirohito. So he would win the support of the army, and the leaders of the army would rule in his name. Similar to the fascists, the militarists would be basically what we would call an extreme nationalist, meaning that they were promoting Japan over everything else. What the militarists wanted to do was that they wanted to solve Japan's economic problems through foreign expansion, similar to the German Lebensraum. They planned a Pacific empire that would include China and many of the other surrounding Pacific islands. And the empire would also provide Japan with raw materials and markets for its good. It would also give the Japanese room for their growing population. So the Japanese business had invested heavily in the Chinese northeast province of Manchuria, which was enriched in iron and coal, as well as great farmland. So the first invasion would happen in 1931, and the Japanese army would seize Manchuria despite objections from the Japanese parliament. Essentially, what they did is they began to yes and themselves into expansion, where the army would fight first, and the Japanese people would get excited, and then the army would continue to conquer more territory. Japanese engineers and military technicians began arriving in large numbers to build mines and factories. Eventually, the Japanese would basically have to bring their claim for their new puppet state of Manchuria in front of the League of Nations, which the League of Nations would reject, and they would condemn the Japanese aggression. But here's the problem. The League of Nations had no power to enforce any sort of decisions, and so in essence, the Japanese would just ignore the protest, and eventually they would just say, you know what, League of Nations, we're not messing with you anymore, and they would formally withdraw in 1933. Now, on July 7th, 1937, the first full-scale war with the Chinese would start. The Japanese and Chinese would exchange shots at a railroad bridge near Beijing, and the Japanese would use this exchange as a basically a reason to have a full-scale invasion into China. Now, despite the Chinese having millions of soldiers, they were also very much um, undermanned, and they were very, or say not undermanned, they were under-equipped when it came to the very technologically advanced and highly trained Japanese soldiers. The Japanese army would push very quickly into mainland China, and it would fall very, very quickly. There would be a terrible massacre in the city of Shanghai, but nothing that would be compared to what would start on December 13th, 1937, when they began to march on the Japanese city of Nanking, or sorry, Chinese city of Nanking. The Qiang forces would already have fled upriver, and they would attempt to establish a new capital, and they would essentially leave the capital of Nanking behind to suffer what many historians refer to as the Rape of Nanking. Historians say upwards of 300,000 Chinese civilians would die. For 6 weeks, essentially chaos would consume the city. The Japanese would line up hundreds and kill them en masse with firing squads, beheadings, and any other sorts of horrific accounts that came out of Nanking that we did cover in class. As many as 57,000 people would die in one single mass execution. And according to Rong Wiem, a research institute in the modern history at the Chinese Academy of Social Science, an estimated 20,000 to 80,000 women would be raped or taken as sexual slaves by the Japanese soldiers, hence the name Rape of Nanking. Many people were disemboweled and simply left to die, and soldiers would even cut off the breasts of their victims and then nail women alive to walls. On December 14th, around noonish, these are some examples, Japanese soldiers broke into the house in Jianyin Street and kidnapped 4 girls and raped them for 2 hours. In the night of December 15th, a large group of Japanese soldiers broke into a dorm of Jingling University and raped over 30 women. Several women were gang raped by more than 6 Japanese soldiers. On December 16th, Japanese soldiers kidnapped 7 girls from the infantry university, aged from 16 to 21, and 5 were later released. According to the report of the 18th, they were raped over 6 times a day. Now, these are just among many of the tragedies that were carried out in Nanking. I'll give you another example. Pan Kai-ming, now 80 years old, who's a former auto worker, carries a calling card that reads Nanking Massacre Survivor. Pan says that on December 14th, 1937, he was among about 300 people who were lined up to face a firing squad. The Japanese sprayed the group with machine gun fire. Pan awoke beneath a pile of bodies. Slowly, I made my way out, he recalled. My coat was completely soaked with blood. I thought I was a ghost. He went up the river to clean the blood from his body, but the river was red, filled with blood running from hundreds of corpses tossed into the water. Pan escaped by pretending to be a messenger for a Japanese officer. As we can see in the pictures of Japanese officers beheading people, the heads of their victims, one man in the upper left-hand corner, he is being bayoneted, and the picture in the center is a picture that is taken of the Shanghai rail station after it was bombed by Japanese fighters, and it is of a singular baby who would be orphaned. These are other pictures of victims of the atrocities. I don't need to go into detail or share them too long. You can see how horrific they are. This is a picture of 5 Chinese prisoners being buried alive. Now, basically there were two people that um, came to strong prominence here, and these will play major roles in Chinese history later on. First off, the forced retreat led by Jiang Jieshi set up a new capital of Chongqing, and at the same time, basically, and many people felt that they had been abandoned by the nationalist Chinese government. And at the same time, a Chinese communist by the name of Mao Zedong would continue guerrilla fighting over the conquered areas. And this was seen as much, well, in essence, much more glorious a way to go out, or a way to go out when confronted with such atrocities. So again, just to reiterate, take now, who did the Japanese invade? What was their reason for invading? What were the outcomes of this invasion, both humanitarian toll and the international response? By the way, the major international response, if I did not say so, was they were condemned, but there was not much done by way of stopping it or declaring war on the Japanese. Our next will be Italy. So again, Italian imperialism. Who did the Italians invade? What was their reason for invading? What were the outcomes of this invasion, both humanitarian toll and the international response? So, as we know, the leader of Italy was the first fascist, Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, aka Il Duce, for the leader. And he saw what happened in specifically Manchuria as a green light to do what he liked. So Mussolini became encouraged to basically be aggressive in his own plan. And his eye was on the African country of Ethiopia, which was ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie. Now, Mussolini dreamed of building a colonial empire in Africa like Britain and France had still. Now, as we talked about, Mussolini was a very bombastic individual. And the reason why they wanted to go specifically into Ethiopia is because Ethiopia had previously stopped Italian imperialist ideologies in the 1890s. And Mussolini, being the bombastic nationalist that he was, felt that this could not fly. So, as I said, the Ethiopians had successfully resisted the Italian conquering attempts in the 1890s, and Mussolini wanted to avenge this earlier defeat. And as he was saying, Italy has at last her empire, a fascist empire. Now, the Emperor Haile Selassie would urgently appeal to the League of Nations for help, and the League's members, including Britain, would condemn the attacks, but they would do nothing to stop them. And even the British, who had power to do something to stop them by closing off the Suez Canal and not allowing Italian supplies or troops to go through, kept it open, but they did pay them taxes, and so therefore the British were okay. By giving Mussolini or giving in to Mussolini in Africa, Britain and France hoped that they would be able to keep peace in Europe. That was their main reason. You give some people that you don't care about in hopes that you would keep peace for yourself. Now, obviously, Emperor Haile Selassie would give a speech to the League of Nations denouncing the Italian invasion and basically saying that it was unprompted aggression. It prompted essentially ineffectual international trade sanctions against the Italians, and eventually later on, people would see Haile Selassie as a major, very important figure on par with Dwight Eisenhower. And in fact, he would become the focal point of a religion by the name of Rastafarianism. So, who did the Italians invade? What was their reason for invading? And what were the outcomes of this invasion, both the humanitarian toll and the international response? All right. Our last one that we are going to discuss is the German imperialism. So, who did the Germans invade? What was their reason for invading? What were the outcomes of this invasion, both humanitarian toll and the international response? So, as we talked about, Hitler's number one goal was to undo the Treaty of Versailles. He hated the Treaty of Versailles, and he hated specifically two provisions of it. One was the limiting of the size of the German army, and two was the fact that Germany lost significant amount of territory during the signing of the treaty. So in March of 1935, Hitler announced that Germany would not obey the restrictions on the German army. And in fact, they had already previously been rebuilding their army in secret in Stalinist Russia. Now, the League would issue only a mild condemnation, basically saying, please don't. And as it said in Germany, banners throughout Germany would announce, today Germany, tomorrow the world. Essentially, the Germans were taking Germany back for Germany, and then they were going to take Europe back for Germany as well. Now, the League's failure to stop Hitler from building up his armed forces basically just said, do what you want, Hitler, and nobody's going to stop you. And so the first thing that Hitler decided to do with his newly built army was to move troops into an area between Germany and France called the Rhineland. Now, the Rhineland is a valley along the Rhine River, which is the southwestern border of Germany, which according to the treaty was forbidden for German military to enter and was a heavy industrial area. Now, the French, unwilling to risk war, backed down. What this told the Germans is that they could do whatever they wished. And, basically, years later, Hitler was heard to say that if he would have been challenged, he would have stopped and he would have backed down. But what this did is that it emboldened them, and plus it gave them a specific amount of industrial strength because it gave them back all of the Rhineland and all of this industry. First, it also, strengthened Hitler's power and prestige in Germany. Second, the balance of power changed in Germany's favor. And third, it showed that France and Britain were weak and that Hitler could do whatever he wanted. And this is going to be sort of the tale of the tape from here on out. Now, Hitler's growing strength would convince Mussolini that he should seek an alliance with Germany. And as we already know, Hitler and Mussolini were already huge admirers of each other. So in October 1936, the Germans and the Italians would reach an agreement known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. And a month later, Germany would also make an agreement with the militarists in Japan. Germany, Italy, and Japan would be called the Axis powers. Now, on November 1937, Hitler would again announce his plans to absorb a couple of other countries back into what he would call the German Empire or the Third Reich. These countries would be Austria and Czechoslovakia. And on March 1938, Hitler would send his army into Austria and annex it, which basically means that he would claim this territory. And he would do this without firing a single shot because the people were thrilled to be part of the Third Reich. Again, this would be a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited a union between the two countries. However, again, the international community would do nothing about it. Hitler would then turn to Czechoslovakia, who had developed into a strong democratic country, and he would demand the western portion of the country that was called the Sudetenland. Now, the Sudetenland was filled with many German-speaking people, but the Czechs would refuse, and they would ask France for help. So here becomes the big issue. France and Britain have a chance to stop Germany, but to avoid war, France and Britain basically give in. in a conference called the Munich Conference that happened on September 29th, 1938. Czechs weren't invited. Britain and France agree that Hitler could take the Sudetenland in exchange that Germany would respect the Czechs' new borders. In less than 6 months after, Hitler's troops would take all of Czechoslovakia. And soon after, Mussolini would take nearby Albania. Essentially, they said, oh, you're going to give us something? Again, you give us an inch, we're going to take a mile. Hitler then demands that Poland will return German territory as well. The Poles refuse, and again, they turn to Britain and France for aid. Britain and France asked the Soviet Union to join them to stop the aggression, but negotiations slow because France and Britain do not trust the communists, and Russia and Stalin resent having been left out of the Munich conference. While this is happening, Stalin also bargains with Hitler. Both Hitler and Stalin reach an agreement, and they publicly commit to never attack each other, and this is called the Non-Aggression Pact, which is signed on August 23rd, 1939. So, last question. Who did the Germans invade? What was the reason for invading? What were the outcomes of this invasion, both the humanitarian toll and the international response? Real quick, we're going to touch on one last topic, which was considered a World War II dry run. There's one essential question to discuss. How did the Spanish Civil War set the stage for World War II? So, Hitler and Mussolini again test the will of democracies of Europe in the Spanish Civil War. Spain had been a monarchy until 1938 when a republic was declared. The government was run by liberals and socials, but there were many people who favored fascist leanings, and one of them was a general by the name of Francisco Franco, and eventually they began a revolt. Thus, the Spanish Civil War would set up the military and Franco on one side against the civilian government and I guess rebels on the other side. I guess you would call them rebels, not sure what else you would call them. Hitler and Mussolini would send troops, tanks, and airplanes to help Franco's forces, and the nationalists would eventually be victorious. Now, the Western democracies would remain neutral, which basically said that the Republican flag, as we see on the right, was sort of left to fend for themselves. Now, only the Soviet Union would send equipment and advisors, but because the whole military was on the nationalist side, the resistance would collapse and Franco would become the fascist dictator. Now, we see this as the dry run for the World War II because it was the first time that both Italian and especially new German military technology would be put into the battlefield to devastating effects. People would be bombed. It would be terrible. So the U.S. follows, however, what we would call an isolationist policy, which argues just keep us out of it. Isolationism basically says that they do not want to be involved at all in sort of any international capacity. In the beginning of 1935, Congress would pass 3 neutrality acts, and these laws would ban the loan and sale of arms to any nations, and they would believe that these would be able to keep the United States out of any other foreign wars. Okay, so please, on the Google Docs or on the Google Forms, write a summary for the essential question and address the objective to the best of your abilities. Okay, all right, thank you very much. I hope to be able to talk to you guys again fairly soon. Thank you.